fair warning, guys, this one is a no eating episode. I don't know if you're the kind of person that likes to watch or listen to true crime and eat, but if you are that kind of watcher, for today's episode, I really would recommend not doing that. This case was labelled by the media as the Cannibal Hotel murder. I have to say that after researching it, I actually don't think that is necessarily true. But the eyewitness who actually saw the aftermath of what happened said that they thought the perpetrator was eating the victim. So it is pretty grim. I think this case will make you feel some type of way. Now, the perpetrator in this case was in and out of mental health facilities, and they were in and out of prison throughout their life. And he was actually released from prison just 2 weeks before this crime took place. This is Red Rum, stories about the true victims of crime. I use news archives, documentary footage and books to research these cases, and so the episodes are accurate to the source material I can find. You can find all episodes as a podcast or YouTube version in the description box down below. Today's case centres around this woman, Cerys Yemm. She was born to her mother Paula, who absolutely doted on her daughter. She juggled looking after Cerys and her siblings, and she did a brilliant job in raising a real close-knit family. They grew up in the village of Oakdale in South Wales, and by the time Cerys was 22, she had this really close group of friends. She got on really well with them, she got on really well with her brother and sister too, and she was just generally extremely well liked and popular. But Cerys struggled with her romantic life. She was in this on and off again relationship with a man called Jay, who her friends described as being really just no good for her. And in fact, Cerys' mother Paula said that Jay could be controlling, and she really saw a change in her daughter when she was around Jay. At one point, Cerys did actually end the relationship, and she ended up moving into this shared women's hostel. She very clearly wanted to escape the relationship. Like any mother, Paula just wanted Cerys to be happy, but given how she felt about Jay and how she spoke about Jay, she knew that he was not the person who was going to be that person for her daughter. He wasn't going to make her feel safe and secure and loved. And so, when Jay was sent to prison, Paula hoped that this might be a fresh start for Cerys. And Cerys started going on nights out, she started meeting other people. It was probably a bit of relief that Cerys might be on her way out of this controlling relationship. But whilst this was all happening and Jay was in prison, he met another prisoner called Matthew Williams. And then, a little while later, through some kind of chance encounter, Matthew had been released from prison and he was on a night out when he met Cerys. They both just happened to be on this night out and they became aware of each other, they began speaking, and the conversation soon turned to being more flirty. Now, when Jay found out about this, he told Cerys that she needed to stay well away from Matthew. But this, of course, was her ex-partner telling her to stay away from this new man that she was very clearly interested in. It seemed obvious that Jay was only really saying this because he didn't want Cerys to be with anyone else. It didn't matter who it was. It wasn't because he was looking out for her, and it wasn't because there was really anything worrying about Matthew. It was because of his controlling and damaging nature. And so Cerys continued talking to him. And it was on the 5th of November 2014, so about 2 weeks after they'd first met, that Cerys and Matthew joined a mutual friend of theirs, and they went to Matthew's hotel room at Sir Howay Arms Hotel. That particular hotel was being used to house people who were in need of shelter and would otherwise be homeless. Matthew was one of those people, and he was allowed to stay in the hotel room, but importantly, he wasn't supposed to have any guests. And so he, Cerys, and their other mutual friend all snuck up to that hotel room that night. And they just tried to be as quiet as possible. They didn't want to attract any attention to themselves. But as the three friends chatted and they drank some beer and things started to get more and more energetic, they started to forget themselves. And once they started getting high together, they began getting louder and louder. Now, it wasn't long before this mutual friend of theirs said that it was time for him to go. And so he left as quietly as he could. He sort of snuck down the stairs and out of the hotel. And he left Cerys and Matthew in the hotel room alone. Now, meanwhile, back at Cerys's family home, her mother was beginning to grow a little bit concerned and wonder where her daughter was at. She expected that her daughter would be home by now. And as 11:30 p.m. came and went and there was no sign of her, she thought it was incredibly strange that she hadn't even heard from her. She hadn't even gotten a phone call. We don't know the specific series of events that happened after that friend left Matthew's hotel room. And it will become clear why that is in a minute. But here's what we do know. The owner of the hotel, a woman called Mandy, was fast asleep that night in her room. And it was into the early hours of the 6th of November that she was awoken by a piercing scream. She jumped out of her bed and ran towards where the scream was coming from. It was a woman's scream, and what was curious was that it was coming from the room that she knew Matthew was staying in. And of course, he's not supposed to have any guests, so at this point, she's just a little bit confused. She began frantically unlocking the door and opening it, and then what she saw was chilling. Matthew was there, but his back was to Mandy and he was sort of hunched over. He was hunched over something and he was absolutely covered in blood. Mandy tried to get a look inside to sort of get a better look at what was going on. And that's when she caught an image of this woman lying on the floor and she was absolutely covered in blood. And as she looked closer, she saw that one of her eyes was missing. Mandy asked what Matthew was doing to the girl and he just replied, quote, "That's no girl." This was enough for Mandy. She retreated away from the bedroom, closing the door behind her and holding on to it so that if Matthew tried to get out, hopefully she would be able to pull hard enough that he wouldn't be able to escape. She used her free hand to grab her phone out of her pocket and dial 999. The moment the operator answered, Mandy said, quote, "There's a lad in room 7. He's actually eating her." Police were dispatched and thankfully they did arrive quite quickly. They entered the hotel room and one police officer said about how the man in front of them had looked possessed. The police then went on to taser Matthew a total of 4 times. One of the officers said, quote, "I have never been more scared in my entire life. I spoke to him, but he was looking possessed. There was an angry sort of look and his eyes were almost black." Matthew had obviously been tasered 4 times. He was on the floor. And so he was arrested at the scene. But it's likely that because he had been tasered 4 times and one of those taser blasts being held for 7 seconds instead of the recommended 5 seconds, Matthew was unresponsive on the floor and it seemed that he had suffered a heart attack and he died. So that is the reason that we don't know the full details of what happened. Matthew can't tell us, he's dead, and Cerys, of course, can't tell us because she is also dead. But the post-mortem revealed a lot of specifics about the actual attack. Cerys's official cause of death was blood loss. She'd suffered 89 separate wounds. And at some point, she had actually been hit on the head with some kind of blunt object. Then she was stabbed in the face with something sharp. The hotel owner, Mandy, said that she thought Matthew had used a screwdriver, but there was no screwdriver that was ever actually found at the scene. And given that Matthew died at the scene and never had the chance to get rid of any weapon or stash any kind of weapon, it's likely that that was an assumption and not necessarily accurate. But it was clear something sharp had been used in the attack. And during the search of the premises, a forensic scientist found a broken bowl that had separated into 15 different pieces of crockery. And parts of this bowl were sharp, and they did have DNA belonging to both Cerys and Matthew. Now, Cerys also had a number of bite marks, and we know from the witness account that she'd lost one of her eyes. Most of those 89 wounds to Cerys were to her face and to her head, with a number of arteries in her face having been cut. And the jugular vein had been punctured, which had caused her to bleed out very, very quickly. The post-mortem also found that despite what Mandy had said about it looking like Matthew was eating her and what the media had later reported, Cerys actually hadn't been eaten by Matthew. But it's likely he had used his teeth in the attack. And that certainly was a very destructive and possibly deadly part of how he killed her. As I mentioned a minute ago, we don't know the ins and outs of what exactly happened that night. Obviously, both people who were involved are now dead. So I think it's probably pretty useful to just take a little bit of a look at Matthew's background, who he was, and how he came to be in that hotel room on that night. What led up to the point that he killed another human being. Matthew Williams was born into a family of 3 other boys, and he was the oldest. He lived with his brothers and his parents in Blackwood, a town in South Wales. Now, I don't know a whole lot about Blackwood. I've never been. I actually had never heard of it before researching this case. I know we do have some listeners from Cardiff, which isn't too far from looking on a map. So let me know in the comments what it's like. Have I gotten it right? Is there anything else to say about it? I did see that there's some really beautiful like countryside woodland surrounding it, which isn't surprising at all. It's Wales. Wales is absolutely beautiful in some parts of it. But to be honest, I didn't really see much else about this particular area. But either way, Matthew did grow up there with his siblings and his mum and his dad, but his parents ended up divorcing when Matthew was 10 years old. And this particular event is what seemed to really start him spiraling out of control. He just stopped listening to all the figures of authority in his life. And he began smoking cannabis at the age of just 11. And by the time he was 13, he was completely kicked out of school. And the reason given was because he just kept getting into fights and was incredibly disruptive. He would return a couple of times over the next 2 years, but by the time he was 15, he was just completely left out of school. He stopped going, and he left school with no qualifications and quite a severe drug habit. Matthew had been experimenting with drugs and alcohol since he was in his early teens, and so by the time he was 15, he'd been on and off them a lot. And Matthew had, it seems, tried to get some help. Now, I hadn't been able to find any details of this in the source material, but it is reported that he attempted to get to rehab to get some help and start to support his recovery. But he was still a teenager at this point, and so he did not continue with his treatment, and things just got worse for him. His drug abuse continued, and this soon led to him becoming violent and aggressive towards others, especially when it came to getting his next fix. By the time Matthew was 15, he was taken to a young offenders institute where he was sentenced, and he was there due to a number of different offences. Over the next few years, he would be in and out of prison, and he gained a huge number of convictions. 78 separate offences were listed, and these really ranged in what they were actually for, but a number of them were for assault, for wounding with intent, and various drugs and weapons offences. Now, Matthew's drug abuse exacerbated some already quite severe mental health issues that he was facing. In 1997, Matthew was found attempting to burgle a property, and as a result of that, the officers that actually arrested him decided that he did need to be referred to a mental health service. He was initially taken into a mental health facility, but he was actually only inside the building for a little under 2.5 hours. They had a very strict and enforceable no drugs policy, and somehow he'd managed to sneak some weed inside. It wasn't long before he was found out. I mean, it's not like he was trying to keep it a secret. He didn't necessarily want to be there. And so he was kicked out. And the next 7 years would see him continuing on with his criminal behaviour, mental health challenges, and excessive drug use. I'll be honest, there wasn't a huge amount of source material on this one, but one thing that struck me as a little bit odd was that there really was nothing about Matthew's social life and how he spent his spare time. Other than when he was inside prison, there's really not much information known. We do know, in terms of his time in facilities, that in 2004, he was taken into a psychiatric facility to undergo mental health treatment. And it was there that he was diagnosed with schizophrenia. Although there are some reasons given later on at the inquest that suggest that this diagnosis is maybe not fully accurate and it is a little bit complex. So Matthew spent a total of 5 weeks at that psychiatric facility before being discharged. For the rest of the year, he was under the care and supervision of a community mental health team. But the moment that ended, he got into trouble with the law again, and this would just repeat itself over and over again. for various different offences, burglary, wounding offences, the list really goes on. And during this time when he was in and out of prison over the next few years, he did admit to hearing voices and having hallucinations. So he was given various different medications, but he simply refused to take them. He continued with his prison sentence, and eventually all of his psychotic medications were stopped. Basically, he'd stopped talking about having any symptoms. So as far as professionals could tell, they said that he was functioning fully and properly and was mentally stable. At this point, he was working in the prison barbers and he was living everyday life pretty normally. And so eventually he was released from prison with an official description of having a, quote, high level of functioning. The inquest heard that just days before the fatal attack on Cerys, Matthew had been having a conversation with his mum, and he told her that the voices were back. He'd also separately told his friends that he was seeing faces in cans of soda, of fizzy drink, and these hallucinations were similar to what he'd previously reported. It was suggested at the inquest that the drug use that Matthew was doing was the reasoning for his hallucinations and for him having heard voices, not schizophrenia. Other sources cited that his drug use made his schizophrenia symptoms worse, his hallucinations worse and more frequent. And it's known from witness testimony that Matthew had taken methadone and amphetamines in the days before the attack. Finally, when the hotel owner Mandy and the police approached Matthew, they could tell that his behaviour was extremely abnormal in how he responded to them. It was suggested at the inquest that he was suffering from agitated delirium, which is a condition that could be caused by drug use. Things or symptoms associated with this are that he didn't seem to be in any pain, and he was actually growling when he was confronted. He also couldn't seem to make any sense of what was happening, and he wasn't responding in any kind of coherent way to anything that was being said to him. As part of the inquest, a risk assessment was completed based on what was known about Matthew's release from prison. That risk assessment found that it was obvious this was a, quote, terrible thing waiting to happen, and that the original risk assessment conducted before Matthew left found him to be of medium risk to the public. But it was found that if this risk assessment had been done correctly, then it actually would have found him to be of very high risk to the public. It was suggested that if a good risk assessment had actually been done, then they may have been able to help Matthew be managed for both the safety of the public and for the safety of himself. Quote, I think even a cursory risk assessment would have realised that the chances of him deteriorating as soon as he was released were massive, that he would take drugs again and this would affect his mental health again, and he would be back to his most dangerous within days. So what really happened is that the drugs pour fuel onto that fire. He would be a dangerous person anyway, but with this massive amount of drugs inside of him, he was a time bomb. It was also found that because mental health professionals were trying or attempting to treat his schizophrenia, they missed clear signs that he was more likely experiencing drug-induced psychotic episodes, and that instead they should have been looking at his attitudes and his violence. And Matthew's attitude towards women was brought up at the inquest, and it was very telling. Whilst he'd previously been in prison, Matthew had written a number of letters to his ex-partner. These letters included threats against her and against her family and against the police. It's hard to comment on the exact failings here because a lot of the information speaks about the authorities not really being allowed to do anything after Matthew was deemed mentally well enough to leave the facility. And also on top of this, he had of course served his full prison sentence, so he was under no obligation to stay within a support system. Matthew actively turned down housing offers and drug and alcohol support. But potentially, based on the inquest and the experts called in, there was a big failing with regards to the risk assessment that was completed and the health assessment on Matthew that eventually allowed him to be freed with no supervision. And that ultimately is what led to Cerys's untimely and horrific death at the hands of Matthew Williams. Thank you for joining me for this episode of Red Rum. This week's recommendation is a film. I went to See No Evil, which... just implementing a little voiceover here. That's not the name of the film. The name of the film is Speak No Evil. I literally did this last week where I said the wrong name of a film. And I know some people only listen to this, they don't watch it. So I just want to clarify. It's not See No Evil, it's Speak No Evil. Will I Ever Get a Grip? Which is, it's got James McAvoy starring in it. I really enjoyed it. I think it definitely had my heart going the whole time. I was on the edge of my seat, and it was quite fast moving, which I love. I'm not really a fan of films, especially horrors, where they're building up the tension in such a way that you're kind of like there for a little bit and then it's a bit boring, and then you're sort of waiting and my mind just wanders a bit. This film, I didn't feel like that at all. I felt like I was really there in it the whole time, and there were some plot points that I didn't love, but I sort of don't mind that if I don't love it all, because then it gives me something to talk about. It gives me something to sort of hope for with the next one. But I would say overall, definitely enjoyed it. Definitely would recommend, especially if you're into fast moving thrillers. And James McAvoy is amazing. In fact, actually, all of the actors are brilliant. I will find out, I'll put it on screen, the person who plays his wife, because she was great. But yeah, as I say, all of the acting was amazing. Other than that, thanks for joining me, and I will see you next week for another episode of Red Rum. Bye.